Thanks so much, Adrian, for the lovely introduction. I wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak about this program of research. It's actually a relatively new area for me because I've been in academia for 30 years, but we've been doing this research for about 5 years. And it was actually really fun for me to pull this all together to tell a story with it. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you today. So we're going to be talking about our program of research in trauma cue reactivity paradigms, using those to investigate mechanisms, learning and cognitive and affective mechanisms that might underlie the high comorbidity of PTSD with cannabis use disorder. So an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to spend a little time on background, so on the overlap of trauma, PTSD, cannabis use disorder, learning theories, theoretically underlying those associations, those strong associations, looking at what is the trauma cue reactivity paradigm and how has it been used. And then we'll kind of get into the evidence from my group. We'll start with a scoping review, and then we'll get into a set of empirical studies that have used the trauma cue reactivity paradigm. We'll end with a recent meta-analysis we did to kind of look at the magnitude of this effect across studies. And then we'll look at what does it all mean in terms of methodological, clinical, theoretical implications, and where do I see things going in the future. So in terms of background, you're going to hear a lot, I'm sure, at the conference, and we even heard yesterday from the DeGroote Center pre-conference workshop about the high rates of use of cannabis for medicinal purposes for those that have experienced trauma and those that are experiencing PTSD symptoms. We're at an early stage in the research. There's not a lot of controlled, like strongly controlled, high quality research at this stage to be able to say whether it works or not. Recent reviews have said there's not really the evidence base there yet, but certainly individual studies show promise in particular domains of PTSD, of treating PTSD symptoms, for example. And so I'm not here to debate whether or not it works. I love this conference because it really goes where the science goes, in terms of like the research on the benefits, but also recognizing the harms. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today, is the concerns about use of cannabis in the PTSD area. So there is cause for concern. Cannabis use rates are higher in people that have had trauma histories. And that you might say, well, that's not a problem if it works, but there's also more cannabis-related problems and cannabis use disorder in those with trauma histories. And that seems to be particularly true for those that have high levels of PTSD symptoms or PTSD disorder. And in fact, PTSD and cannabis use disorder are highly comorbid. They co-occur at rates that far exceed chance levels. And again, why do we care? We care because comorbid PTSD cannabis use disorder has a more complex course, less favorable treatment outcomes compared to people who have just one of those two disorders alone. There's also concern because there's some longitudinal evidence in a review by Bedard Gilligan of this work showing that cannabis use can actually interfere with PTSD recovery. So we don't want to be prescribing or authorizing or promoting use of a product that might interfere with recovery. And again, when we talk about learning theories, we'll see how that might work. Why would that be the case? So certainly cause for concern. So what are some of the learning mechanisms that might underlie these relationships between trauma, PTSD, and cannabis use disorder? Well, the first one is classical conditioning, and that's just related to the PTSD part. So when a stimulus is paired with a traumatic experience, it can become a conditioned stimulus that in the future on its own elicits a negative affect or fear in particular. And so let me give an example. If a person experienced a sexual assault on an elevator, the sexual assault itself is traumatic and elicits fear, naturally, right? But the pairing of the environmental context of the elevator might create a strong association through classical conditioning such that the elevator in the future elicits. So that reminder of the traumatic experience elicits fear. So that's part of an explanation of how PTSD develops. But how does that have to do with substance use, including cannabis? Well, the classically conditioned negative affect is then said to motivate another process, substance use, to avoid or escape that unpleasant negative affect. And that behavior of substance use, just like running away from a feared stimulus and a phobia, is said to be negatively reinforced because the person experiences relief from the negative affect, right? And that substance use can actually, as an avoidance behavior, can actually maintain the conditioned fear because it doesn't have a chance to habituate over time. If the person faced it and didn't engage in escape or avoidance behavior, naturally it would habituate over time. So that's self-medication that we hear about all the time and is very well investigated in a variety of areas of PTSD and substance use, including cannabis. But there might be an additional mechanism that becomes operative, classical conditioning of craving. So when the trauma cue is repeatedly paired with substance use, the trauma cue itself can become a classically conditioned stimulus that elicits craving responses. Just like we've known for years with substance-related cues, right? So if somebody consistently drinks a certain bottle when they're drinking, somebody with an alcohol use disorder, that bottle can become a conditioned stimulus that elicits craving, right? Because it's been so frequently paired with the substance that naturally elicits certain responses. So just the same way, the trauma cues can become conditioned stimuli. And it's this latter mechanism that we're really interested in studying because it adds an additional layer of learning that might promote substance use, right? Because if you're faced with a trauma cue and then that elicits craving, that might elicit increased substance use and develop problems. So how do we study this classically conditioned craving to trauma cues in the lab? We use something called a trauma cue reactivity paradigm. It was developed, used most commonly through the late Dr. Coffey and his colleagues. And it was developed from Rajita Sinha's 2-session paradigm that she uses in the study of stress, not trauma, but stress and substance use behaviors. So the gold standard in this area of research is really this 2-session CRP methodology. In the first session, the participant comes in and tells their trauma story, and it's done through a semi-structured interview to ensure that you get lots of detail about the most traumatic experience. So they're asked about sensory details like the sights, the sounds, the smells that they experienced, the thoughts they were having, the feelings they were having. And it's semi-structured, so people are allowed to sort of tell their story without being interrupted, but then they're probed for those details. Then in between session 1 and session 2, the experimenters go away and create a 3-minute, quite standardized, but personalized trauma cue. And so that's an audio-visual cue. So they get the 3-minute storytelling that uses the participants' own words and own examples, and also a visual cue. So they look for an image that best represents the traumatic experience. So in that second session, they come back and are exposed to that 3-minute audio-visual cue, and then a variety of responses, whatever the experimenter is interested in, can be studied. So it's most commonly used in this area to examine conditioned negative affect and conditioned craving to trauma cues, but it can be used to look at a variety of different outcomes, neural outcomes, automatic cognitive processes, and so on, as we'll see. So when we started in this area, my graduate student, Sarah DeGrace, who's defending her PhD on Monday, you'll see her face over and over today, we did a scoping review of the literature that used the CRP methodology in people who had trauma experiences with or without PTSD and who were substance users with or without substance use disorder. And we looked both at substance cue reactivity paradigms and trauma cue reactivity paradigms in this population. So we were interested in just scoping the literature to see how the CRPs have been used in this population. what types of CRP methodologies have been used and what types of cues have been used, what substances have been investigated, and what are the outcomes, the types of reactivity that have been looked at in this area of scope studies. So we went to a variety of different databases. They had to use an experimental design. All of them had to assess craving because that was our main dependent variable of interest, but they could look at other things as well. And I mentioned the population we were interested in, and we had a variety of search words that we developed as a team and verified with the librarian. I don't have time to go into all the findings, but I want to highlight a few from the 28 scope studies we were able to find. In addition to craving, which was a requirement for the study to get into our review, the most common outcome was affect, most commonly negative affect, but sometimes positive affect. There were few studies that looked at more automatic types of cognition, and I'll tell you later about what I mean by that, but there were only 2 studies out of our 28 scope studies that looked at automatic cognition. And alcohol was the most common type of substance investigated, but a variety of other typically illicit drugs were also examined. So stimulants would be probably the second most common, and very, very few studies, only one from our lab that had done, which I'll tell you about in just a minute, that had looked at cannabis. Some of the problem areas that were identified is that sample sizes tended to be quite small, which you might expect for a lab-based study of this type, and that attrition issues with the 2-session paradigm were common. So people would come in for the first session and not necessarily show up for the second session. So I want to tell you before I get into the studies, the individual studies, some of the common methodological elements of our set of studies on using the CRP in this area. They were informed by the scoping review. So we saw a paucity of research on cannabis, so we decided to focus our research program on studying trauma CRP effects in cannabis. We ran 3 distinct samples and 10 studies. I'll identify when it's the same sample, the 10 different studies with those 3 samples. All participants were cannabis users, so that was identified through the cannabis timeline follow back, and all had trauma histories, at least one traumatic event in their lifetime, according to DSM-5 criteria, and we evaluated that using the Life Events Checklist, or the LEC. So it's a list of potentially traumatic experiences, and they had to identify at least one. Many identified more than one, and when that happened, they were asked to focus on the worst or the most distressing. PTSD was always assessed, and always assessed via validated measures. In all of our studies, we've used the self-report PCL-5, and in some of the studies, we used the clinician-administered PTSD scale. We assessed in all of the studies whether there were main effects of the cue reactivity paradigm, so trauma cues compared to at least one comparator, like most often neutral cues, but sometimes baseline or sometimes substance cues. I'll make that clear. And also PTSD, which we would assess either continuously or in some of our later studies, we put people into categories of likely PTSD diagnosis. And we looked at their interaction because theoretically, people who have PTSD should be even more susceptible to these trauma cue reactivity effects. So we wanted to see if the cue reactivity paradigm and PTSD were interacting on our outcomes. In the first few studies, we're going to focus in on craving and affect because we want to see if we're replicating that in the cannabis area, what's been shown for other substances. And we use validated measures there. In all of our studies, whenever I talk about craving, I'm talking about measurement with the marijuana craving questionnaire short form, which has 4 different subscales that I'll get into later. And most often we assess the negative and positive affect with the PANAS, the validated PANAS. But in our fMRI study, we wanted to have something briefer because of the fMRI environment. So we used visual analog mood scales, also validated. So the very first study that we did in this area was inspired by the results of the scoping review. This was by Ramiro Sanchez et al., published in Addictive Behaviours. We wanted to see whether the gold standard 2-session trauma CRP, PTSD, and or their interaction would predict cannabis craving, different dimensions of cannabis craving on the marijuana craving questionnaire, and negative affect. And we had 51 participants come in for this study. We did the 2-session Sinha and Tweet CRP, and in session 2, they were exposed to personalized trauma, neutral, and cannabis audiovisual cues in the lab in counterbalanced order, and our outcomes were cannabis craving and negative affect. You can see some of the findings up here. We did get effects, expected effects of Q-type and of PTSD on negative affect. You can see that in the bottom figure there. So you can see that the green line is much higher than the red and blue lines. So trauma cues are eliciting much more negative affect than neutral and cannabis cues. And you can see as PTSD scores increase, so does negative affect. We got similar effects for emotionality, compulsivity, and purposefulness craving. I should define each of those. So emotionality craving is the desire to use right now to manage negative emotions. Compulsivity craving is if you're to use right now, you feel like you're going to lose control over your use. Purposefulness is you're planning to use cannabis for its positive outcomes. And then we had expectancy craving, just effects of Q-type. So this is when you're going to use cannabis, you're craving to use cannabis because you expect positive things to happen. And when you look at the items, it's actually mostly expected relief from using cannabis. And we got one Q-type by PTSD interaction on compulsivity craving. You can see that in the top figure there. So you can see the main effects of Q-type and PTSD there. And you can also see that interaction where PTSD is having its strongest effect on compulsivity in the trauma condition compared to the cannabis condition. So there are some methodological limitations, however, with the 2-session gold standard. There's difficulties getting people to come in the first place when they know it's going to be 2 sessions. There's also what was identified in the scoping review that some people are dropping out between session 1 and session 2. And that could lead to a biased sample where you're getting results from the healthiest people, right? Because we know that PTSD has an avoidance component. That's one of the 4 dimensions of PTSD symptoms. So you may be losing the very people that we want to be studying the most and having results for. So Sarah, as part of her thesis, asked the question of whether we could just use the interview itself in session 1 so they didn't have to come back in for session 2. And would that be a valid way of eliciting these same cue reactivity effects on craving and on negative affect? So we recruited 50 participants into this study. They did the personalized trauma and neutral interview from Sinha and Tweet, just the same as in our first study, but it's just in session 1. And we're looking at craving, negative affect outcomes. You can see a Q-type by PTSD effect that we got on negative affect on the top there. So you can see, first of all, the trauma cue is eliciting more negative affect than the neutral cue. And you can see that's particularly true for people higher in PTSD scores on a continuous measure of PTSD. We also got a Q-type effect for overall cannabis craving. In this study, we just looked at the overall score on the marijuana craving questionnaire. So the trauma cue interview seems to be eliciting more craving in people who have had traumatic experiences than the neutral interview. Now, that seems to be a valid way of using a CRP without having to get people come in twice to minimize the distress that they're experiencing. It's cheaper to do, maybe getting a less biased sample, but there's still concerns because they're having to come into the lab. That limits the sample size that you can recruit, especially in a city like Halifax that's smaller. And when we're not seeing that many interactions, right? So it could be that the interactions are smaller and you need larger samples to detect those interactions. And there was also just a practical limitation that we were doing this research during the pandemic and labs were shutting down and opening up and, we all lived through it. So you know what I'm talking about. But we thought about, is there a way to do this research, reach a larger sample, reach them during the pandemic, and get a more, a less biased sample. So we thought about it. We thought, what could we use as a CRP that we could do in an online environment to have greater reach? And we thought about expressive writing. So Pennebaker popularized expressive writing about trauma in terms of its health benefits. And some in this area of trauma, PTSD, substance use disorder, CRP methodology have used this before, but they've never used it standalone. So Jen Reed and her colleagues use it as part of what they do in a CRP, but they do much more. So we wanted to use it as a standalone CRP, and we wanted to adapt it to really make it as equivalent as possible to the Sinha Tweet interview in terms of the types of information that is elicited through the writing. So we had the question of whether an online single session trauma CRP, PTSD, and their interaction would predict cannabis craving and negative affect. And we recruited 202 cannabis users with trauma histories via Qualtrics panel surveys, and they were randomized to either a trauma or neutral expressive writing task. So this is we usually use a within subjects design, but we use between subjects. So they wrote about one or the other, and our outcomes were cannabis craving and affect. Just to show you what the expressive writing task instructions look like. So right after they completed the life events checklist, we asked them to write about the one they identified as the worst for them, the most upsetting. And again, we asked them to just write about that event, to include their actions, thoughts, physical sensations, and emotions that they'd experienced. We asked them to do it for at least 2 minutes, so they couldn't move on in the survey until 2 minutes had elapsed. Then, after they moved on, they got further instructions to close their eyes and continue to imagine the event for another 2 minutes. Again, they couldn't move on until that 2 minutes had elapsed. We had a lot of people from the Qualtrics survey that didn't follow these instructions, didn't necessarily write about what they were supposed to, didn't take the task seriously, sometimes like writing gibberish or things that had nothing to do with what they were assigned. And we got rid of those, and Qualtrics always replaced. So we had a contract with them to get 200 good pieces of good, or 200 good participants. But that is one drawback of this methodology, is that not everybody's going to take it seriously, and you have to really make sure that they are. So with our clean data of 200 participants, these are some of our results. As you can see, PTSD group, likely PTSD or not PTSD, showed effects on all 4 cannabis craving dimensions. And it's not shown here, but we did get a CRP condition effect for expectancy craving that was in the direction we expected. This means that the people that showed the most expectancy craving, if I were to use cannabis right now, I would experience these mostly relief outcomes, and I desire to use it for those reasons. And so we're getting that higher in the trauma writing condition, right after writing about a trauma, then right after writing about a neutral event. And we got no PTSD by CRP condition interactions, despite the larger sample size. And for negative affect, we got pretty much what we had expected in terms of 2 main effects for negative affect. So we got a main effect of PTSD group. The likely PTSD group is showing higher negative affect than the people without PTSD, and a main effect of CRP condition, where those that had written about the traumatic event experienced more negative affect than those that had written about the neutral event. But again, even with our sample size of 200, no interaction. But I want to stress again, negative affect is highest in that third bar on the figure there, where you can see the people with PTSD and who went through the trauma writing task are experiencing the most negative affect. So what are some of the takeaways? It does look like trauma cue elicited substance craving occurs for cannabis, just as it does for other substances of abuse and substance use disorders that are commonly comorbid with PTSD. And we don't necessarily need 2 sessions for a cue reactivity paradigm to elicit negative affect and elicit cannabis craving. And we provided the first validations of the Sinha and Tweet semi-structured interview alone as a CRP, or the standalone expressive writing task as alternative CRPs that can decrease attrition in the 2-session version and increase our sample size, at least with the expressive writing task when it's done via online administration. So that brings us to another dependent variable or set of dependent variables. which involve relatively more automatic cognitive processes. So we've been talking so far about the cognitive process of craving, which is more deliberative. People have access to it. They can report on it. What about cognitive processes that are occurring more spontaneously without the necessity of conscious awareness? And those we call automatic cognitive processes. And we do know that automatic cognitive processes are involved in addictive behaviors and disorders, as well as PTSD. And theoretically, if we go back to our learning models, when classical and operative conditioning happen, that means that strong associations are formed in memory between antecedents, behavior, and consequence. So between the trauma cue, substance use, and relief experiences, relief outcomes or consequences. And that means with those strong associations in memory, when somebody in future is exposed to a trauma cue or a reminder, that should activate all of those automatic cognitive processes in memory. And that should be especially true. The learning should be especially strong in people with PTSD. So this might particularly be a trigger for automatic cognitions in people with PTSD, theoretically. So what we wanted to do was a set of studies that kind of looked at automatic cognitive processes in the CRP paradigm. The first task that we wanted to use is the cannabis approach avoidance task developed by Reinhard Weers and Dr. Kujan in the Netherlands and validated by that group. What happens in this task? It's a reaction time task on the computer. And so people see a variety of pictures, and their task, what they're told to do, is either push or pull. So they have two keys, push or pull. Half of them are told when it's a vertical picture orientation, you pull. And if it's horizontal, you push, and half are given the opposite instructions. Unbeknownst to them, half of each of those pull and push responses or pictures are cannabis related and half are neutral. So what happens when they pull a stimulus towards them, it looks on the screen like it's coming towards them. And when they engage in a push response, the other key press, it pushes away as if they're pushing it away from them. And so you can actually see if people are more likely to pull quickly when it's a cannabis stimulus, right? And so this automatic cannabis approach bias has been shown to be stronger in people who are heavy cannabis users. It's been shown to have predictive validity for cannabis outcomes in the future. So it does seem to be a very valid paradigm. So we wanted to examine whether the single session trauma, CRP, PTSD, and their interaction would predict a selective cannabis approach bias in our population of interest. So this was done at the same data collection as study 3 with 50 participants who did the interview only CRP. So again, personalized trauma, personalized neutral interview, order counterbalanced. After each interview, they completed the cannabis approach avoidance task. And this was with different stimuli so that there wouldn't be habituation to the stimuli. And the two types of stimuli were cannabis and control stimuli. Sorry, I missed my L. And the outcomes were the cannabis approach bias, which is the reaction time for push minus reaction time for pull trials. So here are our results. We got a significant two-way interaction that we had predicted. So PTSD by stimulus type. What's shown here, our dependent variable is approach bias score. So higher scores means more approach to that type of stimulus. And we can see for the high PTSD people, there's a selective tendency to approach cannabis as opposed to neutral stimuli that we don't see at low levels of PTSD symptoms. But contrary to our prediction, there was no further interaction with trauma cue exposure. We thought that that bias would be even stronger after they've been exposed to trauma cues. We didn't see that. So perhaps cannabis approach bias is chronically activated in those with higher PTSD symptoms, and it doesn't need to be activated by trauma cues. However, there's some other possibilities. One is we have 50 participants. We might need more to get a three-way interaction. It might be a small effect that is hard to detect. Another possibility is that reaction times aren't really the best way to study automatic cognition in a trauma cue reactivity paradigm, because there's some research from Jen Reed's lab suggesting that people get preoccupied with the trauma and they slow down on the whole task. So it might not be as valid a task as we're hoping in this population for cue reactivity research. So we thought about, okay, let's reach a larger sample and let's change and look at another automatic cognition task. So our question here was whether online single session trauma CRP via expressive writing, PTSD and their interaction would predict a new outcome, automatic cognition outcome, specifically the accessibility of cannabis information in memory. So the idea is that if trauma cues are closely related in memory in that learning chain that I talked about, then if you're exposed to a trauma cue, that should activate and make very accessible cannabis-related information in memory. So this was the same online data collection as study 4, where people were randomized to the trauma or neutral expressive writing task, and their outcome was to do a cannabis word association task immediately after the expressive writing on something called the CWAT. So what's the CWAT? It's a task which is a sort of classic word association task. I'll give you a word, you tell me the first thing that comes to mind when you see that word. So you're getting at that, like what's readily accessible in memory for you right now with that word. And so embedded in a whole series of ambiguous words were a few cannabis-related words. And we're seeing whether people are likely, when they see the word weed, do they think of garden or do they think of cannabis, right? And so we had 2 people score, and we got good inter-rater reliability. And we're counting up how many times they come up with a cannabis-related word to the cannabis crimes. What we saw here is a significant main effect of CRP conditions. So those that had written about a traumatic experience immediately after had greater accessibility of cannabis information and memory than those that had written about a neutral event. Contrary to our hypotheses, there was no main effect of PTSD group and no PTSD by CRP interaction. So it looks like this might be true of everybody who's had a traumatic experience on their cannabis user. That, writing about or thinking about your trauma might elicit more accessibility of cannabis information. So takeaways from studies 5 and 6, it does look like automatic cannabis-related cognitions might play a role in the high rates of cannabis use and cannabis use disorder in individuals who have been trauma exposed. That seems to be particularly true for automatic access to cannabis information and memory, and those with PTSD, particularly for the cannabis approach bias. And given that we saw different main effects, like different variables that were showing main effects on these tasks, we can't assume that all automatic cognition tasks are influenced by the same factors. And in fact, they're not even meant to be tapping the same processes. That what they hold in common is that they're relatively more spontaneous or automatic, but they're not even meant to be tapping the same thing. The next 2 studies that I want to present to you are about the role of coping motives, or the motivation to use cannabis to manage aversive internal experiences. And theoretically, if we go back to our model, we said the learning should happen most for people with PTSD, and it should happen, the classical conditioning should happen in the context of coping motives, right? Because that's how the trauma cue and the substance use gets paired, is through use to cope. So people who are using to cope more should have that opportunity to make those strong associations between trauma, cannabis use, and craving outcomes, to that conditioning of craving to occur. So we wanted to see whether the relationship between PTSD symptoms and cannabis craving after a trauma cue might be mediated or explained by coping motives for cannabis use. So this was the same data collection as study 2. It was done by Kira Fairley, who I think is here. Yeah, thank you. When she was an undergraduate, this was her honors thesis. So it was the same data collection as study 2. In the 2-session CRP, on session 2, we collect the data on their trauma cue reactivity, their craving to the trauma cue. And the moderator was the 4-item coping motive scale from the marijuana motives questionnaire. We also included enhancement motives based on a reviewer's suggestion that we should, have a comparator to really show is it coping motives. And we did find main effects of coping motives and PTSD symptoms. So both those things are related to cannabis craving after trauma cue, but we didn't find mediation. We were surprised by that. And we thought about, okay, what is it that the cannabis coping motive scale is assessing? It's assessing coping with negative affect. And we thought maybe that's not enough of what we should be assessing for coping motives in this population. So we replicated this experiment using the same data collection as study 3, the interviews-based trauma CRP. We again used the 4-item cannabis coping scale, but we also developed another scale that was based on Hahn's trauma-related alcohol to cope scale, and we adapted it for cannabis. There's 4 items. Each one taps using cannabis to cope with a specific domain of PTSD symptoms. Then we looked at whether we could validly combine the coping with negative affect and the coping with PTSD symptoms into a single composite, and we could. And then we tested mediation. This time we got mediation. We did a conceptual replication and replicated the prior study showing that coping with negative affect alone is not a full mediator, whereas we got mediation with the composite coping motive scale. So what are some of the takeaways? It does seem that PTSD symptoms and negative affect coping motives both contribute to trauma cue elicited craving, but negative affect coping motives alone is not sufficient to explain that association. You have to bring in coping with PTSD symptoms as well to get that mediation or full explanation. Now, for those of you that are more neuroscience focused, you might be asking, what are the neural mechanisms underlying trauma cue-induced cannabis craving? And this is a study that was done by Michaela Ethier, who's defending her thesis next week. And she's here at the conference as well. And because she's much more neuroscience focused than I am, if I make mistakes, she's going to correct me. So this was the same data collection as study 3. So they did the interview, and we did research on the interview. Then for those that were willing, they came in for an MRI session as for session 2. So out of the 50, 31 came in. There was also further exclusions, like they had to be right-handed. They had to have no metal, there were a variety of exclusions, but there was also the willingness to come in. They did session 2 in the scanner. So we did use their interviews to develop the standardized cues, and they were presented in the scanner with trauma, cannabis, and neutral cues. We had to adapt it somewhat in length for the fMRI, but also because of the noise, we used noise-canceling headphones for them to listen to the audio cues, but even so, there's a lot of noise. So we actually had we had printed on a screen that they could see from the scanner their story, so they could read along with it at the same time, and then they got the visual cue at the end, and that we had to adapt some of the outcome measures as well for use in the scanner. We looked at functional connectivity between regions of interest with a final sample of 23 because we had to get rid of 8 for excessive head movement, and the regions of interest were chosen to be brain networks that are associated with stress, with reward, and with cannabis craving from prior literature. So we chose the ventral striatum, structures in the ventral striatum, the dorsal striatum, the cortex, and the limbic system. And looking at functional connectivity is how they're working in unison or correlated. First of all, we checked whether we were actually getting cannabis craving and negative affect in the scanner environment, because it's already stressful, right? It could be that we're at ceiling for all these things just by going in the scanner. And indeed, we got the cannabis craving responses we would have expected. So trauma compared to everything else, cannabis compared to baseline, greater craving, greater negative affect for the trauma cue compared to everything else, and changes and differences in positive affect as well. So the trauma cue showed less positive affect, and interestingly enough, the neutral cue showed greater positive affect. I think people come in quite nervous about the whole situation, so the baseline may not be the best comparator in certain situations. Now, I'm not going to get into all the differences here. I just want to illustrate here that there's lots of places that the trauma cue showed greater functional connectivity between 2 regions than the neutral cue, and some where it showed less. I'm going to go over what those are there. The boxes show correction if you want to be really stringent about multiple comparisons, the ones that passed that multiple comparison. Fewer for cannabis compared to neutral. These are all cannabis users. In fact, about half of them have a cannabis use disorder. So this is a bit surprising. I'll just say that it was hard to get people to give cannabis stories that didn't involve trauma in this population. So in a way, maybe some of these cannabis cues are a bit artificial and not so much their typical experience. And then some cannabis versus trauma differences in both directions. And again, some of those pass the stringent multiple comparison correction. So what does the pattern tell us? We saw increased striatal functional connectivity for the trauma cues. So this can be reflecting habitual use, motivation for drug reward from conditioned drug reinforcement. And that's what we've been talking about today, right? Conditioned craving. And we saw decreased striatal limbic functional connectivity. So with the amygdala, and we were surprised by that. We thought it would be just the opposite, that limbic would be working in conjunction with the craving centers. But remember, this is collapsed across the full cue exposure. It is possible that there's an initial activation of the limbic system, right, of the amygdala, and then that's distressing and it kind of shuts down. In fact, there's blunted amygdalar activity to stress and trauma exposed individuals, particularly those with PTSD, and about half of our sample had likely PTSD. And then it could be that moves on to activation of craving centers as the amygdala is shutting down to try to control the anxiety. Anyway, that remains to be studied, but that's one potential. Now, increased striatal cortical functional connectivity to both the trauma and cannabis cues can be reflecting incentive salience, and decreased connectivity between cortical centers sort of suggests a disorganization. That was to both trauma and cannabis cues and might be involved in impulsive drug seeking. Now, we've also been looking at what people are producing during the writing task, and with some really interesting findings. So we were asking the question of whether CRP condition, PTSD, and their interaction predict emotional and cognitive language use during the expressive writing task. And so this was the same online data collection as study 4 with the 202 Qualtrics participants. We looked at our outcome was language usage according to Pennebaker's LIWC, linguistic inquiry and word count, where it counts up, like you feed in a written text and it tells you like how much of the text is anxiety words, how much is cognitive processing words, and so on from a data dictionary. We did see lots of differences. So the trauma versus neutral expressive writing had less positive emotion, less analytical thinking, more negative emotion generally, particularly anxiety, anger, and sadness words. PTSD symptoms was associated with more negative emotions in the text, more anxiety and sadness in particular, and more cognitive processing words. Now, again, we wanted to look for that interaction, and we only found one for anxiety. We got all excited. And then we look at the nature of the interaction. You can see, first of all, just mention there's lots of zeros in some of these, so we had to use binomial moderation regression analyses. But you can see, what you see here is the trauma writing condition has more anxiety words than the neutral, tendency for things to go up with PTSD symptoms, more anxiety words, but the interaction's not what we thought at all. The trauma stays flat with PTSD symptoms and the neutral goes up with PTSD symptoms. So what we think might be going on here is that the people with more PTSD symptoms might be in their writing avoiding talking about the anxiety that is experienced, right? So that they're not going up the way you would expect. So that's a caution about using this online expressive writing where there's no experimenter to see what they're doing and encourage them to engage in the task. So you might also be thinking, what are the ethics of this trauma CRP, right? I bet a lot of you have been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about that because the welfare of our participants is paramount. And we always claim that, things but we haven't had any problems with this when we put it into an ethics committee, or we talk about other, checking in with other labs that have used this and no adverse events and so on. But really, is it how safe and how ethical is it? So we invited people back from our first CRP study, and we were able to get 33 of them to come back out of the 51, and to do a questionnaire to reach them. This was months later. And the first 10 we invited to do a qualitative interview. And the questionnaire asked about lasting distress, perceived ethics, safety, any benefits that they saw of participating. The qualitative interview asked the same things and just was getting more of, in their own words. So here's what they think about the ethics. You can see that most of them thought it was extremely ethical, and nobody was given any responses in the bottom. You'll see that pattern repeats itself over and over in the few figures that I'm showing you today. Lasting distress, the majority of people had no lasting distress even immediately after participating. One person did have extreme distress, but by days after participating, nobody had extreme distress. The very large majority had no distress at all. In terms of safety, did they feel safe? You could see that the very large majority, all but one, are saying moderately or extremely, with most people saying extremely. A lot of people saw potential benefit of the method and this type of research for better understanding the disorder and improving treatment for patients. Interestingly, in the qualitative interviews, a lot of people talked about benefits to themselves. Like, they talked about benefits to others, motivating them to participate. But they also said, I expected it to be really distressing. It was while I was there, but it was also really helpful. And they talk about helping them organize their way of thinking about it, or facing something they hadn't been willing to face before, things like that. So people also talked about it being safe and ethical. They felt that their confidentiality was being protected. They felt like people checked in to make sure they wanted to keep going. Relevant methods, they thought that the personalized approach was really helpful rather than just having a standardized cue. They liked that it was the cue for that was personalized to them, and overall found it a rewarding experience and felt they appreciated the chance to help with science that might help somebody in the future. So coming full circle, we started with the scoping review, and we're going to end with our most recent meta-analysis. So our objectives were to quantify the magnitude of the trauma cue elicited substance craving effect in substance users with trauma histories, look at moderators of the effect, like when is it bigger and smaller, like PTSD symptoms, like the different methods that people are using for the CRP, and so on, or study or substance type, for example. And then we wanted to test a mediational model with negative affect that I'll explain in a minute. I'm not going to go into the methods. I'll just say that they're the same as what I described for the scoping review, except that we focused in on trauma cue reactivity studies. So it wasn't substance cue reactivity studies were not included. That wasn't the focus. And we started with 151 records that were identified through database searching. Through all of our various exclusions, we ended up with 17 studies that fit our criteria. Here you can see across the 17 studies, 15 compared trauma and neutral cues. And here we got an effect size, a moderate effect size of 0.47, a D of 0.47, for trauma to produce more craving than neutral cues. And that was significant. That's with nearly 1,000 participants across studies. We didn't get that when we looked at baseline to trauma. That could be because it's only 4 studies and we don't have a large enough sample size yet to see an effect. It also could be, remember when I mentioned baseline might not really be baseline because people come in anxious about this before they get going. And so they might already be having some craving. Trauma substance cue differences. Some studies show trauma cues to be produce greater craving than substance cues. However, that's not consistent. Only 6 studies have looked at it thus far. From what we know at this point, we can say trauma cues elicit as much as substance cues, but not necessarily more. There was very low I-squared values, percentage heterogeneity. So on the good side, it means this is a very consistent trauma cue reactivity effect. On the bad side, we couldn't look at moderators because there's not enough variability in the data. This is just showing you the figure. You can see across the 15 different studies, we've always got a positive effect, lots of variability, but with that sample size, that's producing a medium effect size. We also tested a mediation model, which you can do across studies using a technique called two-step meta-analytic structural equation modeling. So it works just like a structural equation model. You could test your mediation model, but you're doing it across studies. And so we looked at whether trauma cue effects on substance craving might be mediated through greater negative affect. So is it negative affect that's driving the substance craving in response to the trauma cues? And in fact, we got full mediation, so evidence for that mediation effect. So what can we determine from this meta-analysis? The moderate effect size gives a comparator for people in the future, people like me who have methodological interests. So I'm developing a new CRP. I could see how does it work compared to what's out there in the literature. Right? It gives people a reference point. The mediation model is consistent actually with Baker's theory that negative affect that's elicited by trauma cues might be the primary driver of substance use behavior, and in this case, of trauma cue-induced substance craving. And also, it makes us think a little bit about what that craving is, that it really might be more relief craving, right? If it's negative affect that's driving it. So I want to get into the implications of all of this work. There are some methodological implications. We've got the validation of two new, the first time validated anyway, CRPs that only require one session and reduce attrition. So the online expressive writing can also increase the reach. But I just want to caution about right now the controllability of the expressive writing when it's done alone without an experimenter present, and the slight reduction in the magnitude of the effects. And then the measurement of cannabis use motives in the population, we should be thinking about going broader than just negative affect management, that it might be PTSD symptom management that's motivated substance use as well as negative affect management. I don't know how many people here are really interested in this work, but for me, this is really fascinating that negative affect mediates this, because from classical conditioning perspective, you don't require negative affect. So it means we've really got to be considering both operant and classical conditioning operating together. We've got to think a little bit, I think, about the role of chain mediators. It might start with an external trauma reminder that activates internal cues, negative affect and physiological arousal and so on. And both of those act as potentially discriminative stimuli that tell you if you use substance right now, you're going to experience relief. So that's more from kind of an operant conditioning perspective and chained antecedents. And then I think thinking more about that specific role of relief consequences. In terms of clinical implications, we do know that we want to target negative affect, we want to target craving as targets in our interventions. We know that exposure therapy will help with reductions of negative affect to trauma cues, and that it's been adapted for use with comorbid PTSD substance use disorder, not cannabis disorder in particular, but it suggests we might want to use the COPE intervention that's been developed by Sudhi Bhatt and so on for people with cannabis use disorder, PTSD. And our findings around expectancy cravings suggest that we should be thinking about including modules that target expectancy craving, perhaps by expectancy challenges. The success of the online expressive writing suggests you might be able to use that as an intervention to increase the reach of exposure-based therapy. But again, we're at early stages, and there's that issue of the controllability of it that we have to get around. And the potential for modules that could target these automatic cognitive biases. I would never advocate for them as standalone interventions, but maybe as a module and part of what we do. So for example, there have been cognitive bias modification procedures used in people with substance use disorders that effectively train them to avoid instead of approach those stimuli around the substance. We could have it adapted for this population and added in as a module. and targeted towards those with PTSD since they're more susceptible. And in terms of future directions, I see a lot of potential for the use of the LIWC, both clinically, using expressive writing, and theoretically looking at what's happening with what people are writing and how's that related to their experiences of negative affect and of craving. And in terms of CRP methodology, we've got to figure out how to manage that controllability of the online expressive writing CRP, do some comparisons within the same study. We always made slight changes, getting enthusiastic about questions and making maybe too many changes to compare. So we're kind of comparing apples and oranges when we go across studies. And the ethics, although I feel quite comfortable that it's ethical to do the CRP methodology as we do it in the lab, but I wonder about the double whammy of the MRI environment and the CRP methodology. So it would be interesting to study participants' experiences of doing both of those in combination. And then I think automatic and controlled cognitive processes, looking at how they each contribute to variance in cannabis outcomes, and to study CRP and PTSD effects on expectancies in particular, given we got that expectancy craving dimension coming out, and trying to separate out reward and relief craving and studying them via both self-report measures and via more reaction time automatic processing measures. I want to acknowledge the big team that's involved in this research. These different studies that I presented today are a large number of funders for this work over time, the Biotic Imaging Center, and also my close collaborator and friend, Sean Barrett, who passed away just last month. He is quite involved in this research, and he's the one that kind of got me involved in key reactivity research. So I thank him for his brilliance and miss him every day, and just wanted to do a particular shout out to him. So I'll open it up now for questions.
Sure, just do this wonderful themselves. Question the methodology. You mentioned that some of the PTSD people at very good level cannabis use stuff that counties.
Yeah.
Did you were the style upon like or other is that too much that the farmer you got the most?
Yeah. In most of the studies, we would control for that in sensitivity analyses. So it's a really good point. I guess I should mention, I said they were always cannabis users. We had a pretty, a fairly heavy cutoff for our first two lab-based studies, the first two data collections, which was at least 1 gram a week over the past month. Then when we went to the the online study, we wanted to keep that same level so that we could compare across studies, but Qualtrics wouldn't agree to a contract. They were worried that they wouldn't be able to recruit sufficient, like 200 people. And I don't know, I kind of think they might have been able to, but anyway, so it was 1 gram in the last month. So it was quite a change in the requirements to get into the two studies. I guess I feel like even so, like maybe it was a good thing because we did show even with a lighter using population that you're still getting these effects. But once again, when I made that comment about comparing across studies, sometimes it's a bit of comparing apples and oranges. Like that's why I'm saying we should do it all within one study so that you really can compare directly. But we always looked at so we had 2 measures of cannabis. We had the timeline follow back. So we had how much they were using, and we had the QDIC R in all of our studies. And in the 2 lab-based studies, we had a SCID interview on cannabis use disorder. So I can say from that study that, again, it was about half of the people had a cannabis use disorder. So we were over-recruiting people with cannabis problems into this research. We weren't trying to, but that's who presents. So for example, I think it's really important to say the automatic cannabis approach bias study you might say, oh, well, that's PTSD is highly comorbid with cannabis use disorder with greater cannabis use. So that could be driving all your whole effects, but we still got PTSD effects even when we controlled those things, which is kind of interesting. Like it's saying that there's something about PTSD that's more than just the fact that they're using more cannabis that's driving this cannabis approach bias. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't figured out what it is yet, but yeah, I agree that it's important to do that. We're limited by sample size. And so for the Q-R, like we would put them into the groups, but the largest group was always the more severe users, the more severe cannabis-related problems.
So that's it. Once we get back to the check, like your things are actually the box side.
Yeah.
If you have obviously they very also math that helps side to this actually big alcohol.
Yeah.
They also be
To it. Yeah.
to that.
Yeah.
Or it's that of.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, if I get a little house that they are elusive or simply not theirs, and like the negative effects are sufficient to explain the morbidity and make me go whoops.
Yeah, I agree. So like I felt really frustrated about it because, especially when we went to the 200 thinking they might be smaller effects and then we're not seeing them. But of course we went to 200 and at the same time lowered to less cannabis use. So that might be part of it too. You might, in 200 with more, more cannabis use, you might get them. I kind of think, like I'm thinking about it differently now. And I'm thinking, like, when I look at those figures, those two main effects, every time you get two main effects, it may be there's some threshold above which you need to be pushed for it to be really motivating for continued cannabis use. And, we'd have to figure out what that threshold is, but I don't know if I can find an example figure. I guess it's not up there anymore. But, for negative affect, for many of our effects in our first study and lab-based and on the online, the expressive writing, we got like main effects, two main effects, a PTSD effect and a trauma cue reactivity effect for expectancy craving. Like maybe it's just you have to be pushed, like you have it, like somebody with PTSD has these things sort of chronically activated, and then the trauma cue exposure pushes them above a level that motivates their use, right? And that it's just not enough. Like the people without PTSD or with low levels of PTSD symptoms, they get pushed up too, but it's not at a level, not pushed to a level that is meaningful for their use. So that, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. I don't know if they're elusive or if they're, like, even again, in our meta-analysis, we're not seeing anything. And I know the meta-analysis is always kind of a rough index, right? Because there you're looking at, like, what proportion of your sample has PTSD. That's how you do it. And there we're not seeing enough variability. But there wasn't a lot of variability also in the samples. Like, most of the samples had largely PTSD populations, either all or a large proportion. So maybe again we need more variability. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I do feel like the two main effects are potentially important. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, word. So
yeah.
I know better than all what PTSD. You better. This is the disorder common matter.
Yeah. So when you look across the literature, people in this area sometimes focus on particular trauma populations, like they'll look just in military trauma, or they'll look just at sexual assault trauma, and they reduce that variability, right? Which is a good thing. But we always felt, first, like in a smaller city, are we going to get enough people if we restrict trauma, the trauma type? And And second, I think we felt it was an advantage to be able to speak across trauma. So that's why we chose to not restrict on trauma type. I would say anecdotally, like we haven't had sufficient sample sizes in our individual study to look at that statistically. Anecdotally, I think I've heard from the people running it that sometimes it's harder with more repeated childhood trauma to get people to give a specific example. So they have kind of these more overgeneral memories. And what Sarah DeGrace would do in those situations is she would say, can you think of the worst time that it happened? Like think of that time, and she'd be able to kind of pull more for a specific incident. But with those repeated traumas, it was harder to get those specific memories. So I wonder if we're maybe washing out our effects a little bit by including that group, but they might be unique. But that's just, again, anecdotal.
The earliest often, while he was to see on there's some information that shows recurred me sure that
Yeah.
I'm in to other comments as well. What is doing is it's in the chat guy who's this
Yeah.
and that even to filter or they are not serious.
Yeah.
What was the rate of that?
Very high. I can't remember the numbers, but it was very high.
When you take a suction bias and the chaos and
It's really good. A really good question. I mean, they weren't being recruited into a study where they were, it wasn't a therapy study. I kind of think you probably have a combination of people that don't do it because of avoidance. But also, I think because of just difficult personalities, right? Like, I'm not doing this part of this, like, I'm not going to comply with this. Because some of them just kind of wrote silly garbage kind of things. We've talked about this in the lab recently to take a look at that because Qualtrics actually gave us all the data. So we were the ones that screened that part of it. They'll do a screening for like straight lining, and if you give them specific, like we would, include some check kind of items, like to make sure people attention check items, and they would exclude based on those kind of characteristics. But for the online writing, they passed it to us. We looked at it and then told them we want these ones replaced, but they gave us all that data. So we could look, at least for the ones that were identified as valid on the Qualtrics screen, and compare those who were excluded to see if it was more avoidant, like, because we have PTSD symptoms, like would PTSD avoidance symptoms predict, being less likely to comply with that, right? That to me, that's the most concerning. If we're getting a sample of people that have less severe PTSD because they're finding this like too traumatizing or potentially stressful.
That's really that.
Yeah. So we should have looked at that, and we still can.
But all of questions think about your question. I don't think it was freaking but
Yeah.
so that's one what's very substance combination.
Yeah. I don't feel, honestly, I don't feel qualified. I don't know that literature well enough. My history in getting into this area with cannabis, if you go back 30 years, I was doing research on benzodiazepines. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels, right? Like, so barbiturates were seen as really addictive and benzos not as an alternative, right? And that you could get people onto something that was safer. And I see a lot of parallels happening in cannabis. So I guess I'm concerned with cannabis. Psychedelics, from my understanding, don't have that same addictive potential, but, it's not my area. So I really don't feel qualified to comment.
Yeah, probably just a quick question. So I understand some of the board that they've been sending about that analysis.
Yeah.
The lack of
Yeah.
Continue to explore some of the subjects.
Yeah.
All of that time to the ritual tension on the from the author.
And that's a great idea. What a great idea. And I mean, it should be possible with 17 studies, right? Yeah, that's a really good idea. And that would, yeah, I love it. Do you want to collaborate? But anyway, yeah, that's a great idea. And I think, it's a lot of the same people working in this area too. So there might be more, often when you approach authors for old data, it can be difficult. And some of this is older data, but yeah, great idea.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the military, I do all this is just and huge stuff.
Yeah.
Now, military except that within the duty English to you did. Today, they having looked at other assets, you'll change stuff.
Yeah.
As a running, they really did you next.
Yeah.
But these the other things, they're going to become look.
I have a few comments on that. It's a great question. I wish the LIWC would do that. It doesn't. It does anxiety, sadness, and anger. The other piece, so we could we could go through and code that, I think, because LIWC is not yet, or maybe I think other people, you can develop data dictionaries, right, and modify them for the LIWC. That might be an idea. I'm going to tell you about a different area of research. During the pandemic, people came into the hospital lab environment and they had to wear masks. And I had a conversation with a colleague who does dog olfaction research. And he was saying, I was telling him we were doing some PTSD work. And he said, now they're saying that the dogs can detect PTSD before the person is even aware. And they can be, what do you think about that? They could be helpful in distracting them before they have a full-blown flashback. And I said, well, we could test that if you want. And so we got into this great conversation. And during the pandemic, during the study that was Sarah DeGrace's, so it would be like the study, I guess I called it study 3, but the expressive writing task. And then they came in for Michaela's on session 2, they came in for the fMRI. So we had 2 opportunities to have masks. So we took the masks away from the people, presented them to the dogs, and we had this whole 2 different paradigms for the dogs to learn to detect and discriminate between the neutral and the trauma masks. And they could do this at they had to go through many dogs, but it was a proof of concept study. And the dogs could do this, certain dogs could do this at very high accuracy. And then we looked at how it correlated with the human reactions. And one of the dogs was responding to anxiety and fear, and the other dog was responding to shame, which is really cool, right? And apparently, there's 2 different reactions. So there's the kind of an early adrenaline and then a later cortisol. So it might be that those 2 things are biologically distinct, and the dogs were just picking up on different aspects. So we just got a grant to continue this research, which will fund me to keep doing this research with humans. But we'll keep the masks and we'll do the dogs, but we've got a collaborator who's going to look at what volatile organic compounds are being are coming out in the breath samples that the dogs are detecting. So it's kind of it just kind of fits with what you're talking about, this moral injury and shame and so on. And certainly anecdotally in some of the stories, that's very much a theme. Yeah.